you to find the piece of paper and pen that you got when you came in. Does anyone need one? Did you not receive one? All right. Ryan, thank you. Anyone else? We have a few over here. Yeah. Just kind of keep your hands up, and Ryan will help you out. Awesome. So once you have it, and just keep your hands up if you still need it, Ryan will get to you. And once you find it, you can kind of either hold on to it or set it next to you. We're going to need it like in a minute, but I just want to make sure it's handy. So as we kind of settle into this space, I invite you to close your eyes and just become aware of your body sitting here in this particular space, or if you're listening, watching elsewhere, wherever you are, just like that awareness of like yourself here. And then draw your awareness out a little further into the room filled with people. Go a little wider still to the neighborhood we're a part of, and just kind of keep zooming slowly wider and wider out. And not necessarily just looking at geography, but specifically, I want you to hold the always present cultural milieu that we're a part of, that we just like exist in. Like just be aware that that's there, right? Just around us. Like the air we breathe, even as we sit in this holy space together, there are the messages, the expectations, the pictures of what life, quote, should be for us that's just coming at us all the time. So I just want to hold that awareness of like that's there, right? This just cultural stuff that we swim in all the time. So tapping into those subtle and sometimes not so subtle messages, I invite you to hold a question that I want you to actually answer. And to answer it for yourself. So not the general, well, people would usually say, but like answer it for you, how you would respond to this. So from the messages that you receive culturally and the stuff that's around us, advertising, however else, what does success look like for you? What's success? How do you like arrive? What have you been told? And to put into language of what we've been talking about at Salt House in this last month, like how do you grow up? What does adulting look like? And not like the meme version of adulting, but really like what are you told? Who are you told to become? What does that look like? So as responses come up for you, I invite you to pick up that paper and write them down on there. And to really, and do it like the unedited brainstorm version. No one's going to see this, but it's just for you to kind of have a place to like name things. So it really is a question of expectations. What does it look like to succeed, to grow up, to arrive? What are we told? So just take a minute to do that, and I'm going to ask if you want to share anything, but just take a minute to tap into that for you. So feel free to kind of keep pushing through. Let it keep coming. If anyone wants to name some of the stuff that's coming up, sometimes that's helpful for the rest of us. Like, oh yeah, that's me too. Or, oh, something a little bit different, but yes. So anyone want to just shout something out? Stability and security. Yeah, and there's a lot to what that can look like. But yeah, very good words to capture that. Yeah. Debt-free. Love. Gaining respect. Yeah.
Winning and climbing and conquering.
Totally. Winning, climbing, conquering was on my list. What's that? A place to live. I had a lot of the 2.5 children, perfect marriage, a house that's all updated and fancy, and the ideal female body, and pastoring a church that just explodes with people because it's so amazing. Just those, all the measures of success in those kinds of ways. And just a big old dollar sign, because I feel like money and so many things. Anyone else want to say anything? So thank you for writing, reflecting, sharing. Hang on to you don't have to actually hold it the whole time, but do feel free to add things if stuff comes to mind. Just be holding that question as we go through this time together. We'll come back to the list in a little bit. So for today and for Lent, we're going to begin to explore how, although much of the lists that we have can seem like what it means to adult and to succeed, various religions and models of human development suggest a bigger understanding of what success and the point of life, what all of that can look like. And I wonder if we might talk about that a little bit. Does that sound okay? So it's looking at a different way of seeing things in the cultural place where we live. So specifically, various religions and models of human development suggest that there are the two halves of life. Dun, dun, dun. Have you heard this before, this phrase? Yeah, so it was psychologist Carl Jung who first popularized the phrase, the two halves of life, to describe the two major tasks of what life is, what that flow looks like. And I want to dig into this in a way that's going to actually orient us for our journey through Lent. So stick with me as we're going to lay today just some foundational theory stuff for where we'll head in the weeks to come. But I'm thrilled for how this relates also to our adulting journey. So I think it'll be a really great time for us. So you ready? Ready for that? Brain engaged? Game on? Game on. Okay, game on. So there are these two halves of life. The first task, the first half of life, is to build a strong container, the container of who we are. So it's all the identity work, it's figuring out who we are, how we exist in the world, what some actually would call the false self, or Freud would call it the ego, which sounds so negative to say false or ego, but like anything from Freud is going to sound negative. That's just the way it is. But Carl Jung emphasizes it is really important, actually, that we develop a strong ego, a strong container of who we are. Like that's we need to do that work. But here's the thing, we take it for granted as like that is the very purpose of life. But it's not. There's a whole other task that comes later, a whole other half, if you will, to the whole. And so this matters because most of what our culture tells us to do, much of the stuff that we could list out, much of the list that we've made, most of it is only the work of the first half of life. But there's so much more. And saying that, I mean, you probably have stuff that we will see actually falls into the second half of life, so it's not that binary. But so much of what we are told to do and be is the first half of life work, like figuring out who you are, the security stuff, the successes, figure out who we are. But we do just need to call out that in the first half of life, well, that whole way of being, that we live in a first half of life culture. So we just need to name like that is where we live. Largely concerned about surviving successfully, right? Would you agree? Like that's first half of life, survive successfully. So again, we do need to do this work. So it is things like establishing an identity, a home, relationships, friends, community, security, successes, and achievements, and building a proper platform of who we are. So it's kind of that false self, ego self stuff. So we need to do that. So we're building that container, and having a resilient container is important. But inevitably, we will discover that the real purpose of life, and our identity, we'll begin to discover that there's something much deeper within us than just the positive image that we're like building to present to the world. So there's a crossing over then that happens for us, a movement into the new task, the second half of life, which, by the way, is not a chronological thing. Just because we live longer doesn't mean that we will cross over into the second half of life. I've met 10-year-old children who are in the second half of life, and I've met 67-year-old folks who are not in the second half of life. They're still in that first half. But if the first half of life is about building our container, who we are, like achieving, climbing the ladder, the second half of life is realizing that there is so much more than the container. We begin to move through and beyond the need for all those externals, all the jockeying, all of the defining and categorizing. So we begin to tap into what many call the true self. Thomas Merton, he uses the phrases false self and true self to talk about who we are in these two halves of life. And in the second half of life, our ego it starts to serve the true self, or the soul, or the inner and inherent identity that we have. We've used the language this month of our inner blueprint. So that's what we're talking about, the image of God, the imago Dei in us that maps out just who we are designed to be. So in the second half of life, that true self is cracked open, discovered. It becomes what drives us in that second half of life, that inner blueprint. And I think there is some moving back and forth. I don't think there's and now I'm over the line. I think it's not as clear as that, but there is this movement into the second half of life. So we're going to continue to fill out this picture of the two halves of life in the weeks to come. But for now, are you kind of just getting a general picture of, there's kind of this go, build kind of focus, and then there's something deeper that happens as we kind of live into the inner blueprint, those two halves of life. Starting to get the picture? Are you listening? Are you there? Okay. Yes, okay, cool. So the two halves of life. So I wonder, just as you start to digest this, maybe you're considering your own journey, and maybe you're like, which half of life am I in right now? I don't know if you're starting to ask yourself that question, or maybe you're thinking of someone else you know and diagnosing what half of life they are in right now. Or maybe you're thinking that the freedom and the possibility and the getting out of the cultural expectations stuff of the second half of life, man, that sounds really good. I think I'd like some more of that. And so you're wondering maybe there's a way to get there, and maybe I'm going to give you an answer for that. Anyone thinking? Yeah. So I know for me, as planner, I'm rather disciplined, goal-oriented person. When I started to learn about this stuff, I just wanted the bullet points and the action plan. So two halves of lives, how to get to the other side. Just tell me how to get there. Anybody with me? Right. So it's pretty laughable that that's how we feel about it, because guess what? Bullet points are so first half of life, right? That is so first half of life. But also, we just can't work our way into the second half of life. That's not how it happens. I know, it sucks. So how do we cross this threshold between the two halves of life? Well, thanks for asking, because we're going to talk about that. So I want to go to the Jesus story to flesh out what that looks like, the kind of transitioning, because the Jesus story absolutely aligns with these psychological theories that have been around for a while. So there are a number of places in the Old and New Testament that we could turn to make the point that we want to make today, but we're going to look at two things Jesus says. The first is in Matthew's gospel, but it's also in Mark and Luke's gospel, which is always interesting, good to note. So the Pharisees and the scholars are there, and they're with Jesus, and they're looking for answers similar to what we're asking now, signs of how God is a part of what's happening, kind of some proof that Jesus who he says he is, and how they can be a part of that. They want bullet points. They want miracles is what they're talking about. So notice Jesus' response to them, and then we'll unpack this a little bit. So here's the first text we'll look at for today, which I think is on the screen. Yes. So it's Matthew 12:38-40. Later, a few religion scholars and Pharisees got on him, that him being Jesus. Teacher, we want to see your credentials. Give us some hard evidence that God is in this. How about a miracle? Jesus said, you're looking for proof, but you're looking for the wrong kind. All you want is something to titillate your curiosity, satisfy your lust for miracles. The only proof you're going to get is what looks like the absence of proof. Jonah evidence, or the sign of Jonah is what it says in other translations. Like Jonah, 3 days and nights in the fish's belly, the Son of Man will be gone 3 days and nights in a deep grave. Okay, Jesus, what do you mean? So this is a significant moment. This really is a very significant moment, again, because it's in 3 of the Gospels, so we know that there's a certain weight to it. That's always good to notice that. What Jesus says here is referred to, again, by scholars as the sign of Jonah. And Jesus essentially says, this is the bottom line. You guys are asking for all these things, but what matters, all you're going to get is the sign of Jonah. The sign of Jonah is what matters. Mic drop, walk away. And they're going, what? So we might not catch the weight and what he means, but part of the point that's in there, Jesus is saying, this is how transformation happens. Jesus' primary metaphor for the mystery of transformation is what he calls the sign of Jonah. He says, this is how it happens. Jesus tells the growing crowds, you're looking for the wrong thing. And he then says that the only sign he will give, the only thing they need to know is the sign of Jonah, which looks like an absence of a sign, is what he says, right? So, what does that mean? So as a Jew, Jesus knew well the graphic story of Jonah, the prophet who was running from God. We know that story too. And he was used by God almost in spite of himself. Jonah was swallowed up in the whale and taken where he'd rather not go. And this was Jesus' metaphor for the sign, the evidence, ultimately the path that leads to transformation and really to everything. Like the bullet point is the whale. The path he's describing is the path of death and resurrection. Jesus names it here that this is what he will do, his own death and resurrection, and the less obvious conclusion and the deeper meaning for the crowd to make is that it is absolutely something they and we will do too. Rather than look for impressive miracles or the bullet points or the formula to follow, Jesus says, for transformation, we go inside the belly of the whale for a while. Then and only then will we spit up on a new shore and understand our call, our place, our purpose in a new way. So how do we move into the second half of life? It happens, I'm sorry to say, in being swallowed up by the beast. It's when everything goes dark. It's when everything fails us, when we face falling, losing, failing, suffering, and transgression. We come up against situations in our lives that we can't fix, that we can't control, that we can't explain, change, or even understand. So that journey, that further journey into the second half of life comes in failure and suffering and humiliation. As we're forced then to look at things that we never would have otherwise. And our container, our whole structure, our mission, our focus begins to fail us. So let that sink in for a moment, that this is how transformation happens, how we mature, adult, grow up. And given your own journey, given the journey of those that you love around you, does this resonate for you? That the movement into the second half of life happens when we fail, when our container fails us. And it's awful when that happens, right? It is darkness and unknown in the belly of the beast. We seldom go there freely into the belly of the beast. We have to be swallowed up, unless it's only when we face major disaster, like the death of a friend or a spouse or the loss of a marriage or a job. We usually will not go there. But when we do go there and we're spit out on the new shore of the second half of life, we find there's a new task at hand, a discovering of our inner blueprint driven by and into the further journey that's for us. And our former container that has failed us has to stretch, it has to die in its present form or even be replaced with something better. Friends, this is the Jesus story over and over again. Do you hear it? We're talking about death and resurrection, right? And today, as we begin 6 Sundays of Lent, taking us to the cross, this is the time where we let our curiosity, our very lives get caught up in the death and resurrection of Jesus. And we do it because this is the very pattern for the mystery of transformation. So we're into our second month now in our larger journey of transformation as a church community. We're planning to launch. We've been tied to our parent congregation, Holy Spirit Lutheran Church, for the 2 years, 11 months that we've been in existence. And we're going to be a freestanding church on our own July 1st of this year. So we've called this journey our #adulting journey. Because even though we are still toddler age, it's time to grow up and launch and leave the nest. And so this Lent, it's always a yearly time to focus and listen to our own spiritual growth. We here are focused around what the Jesus story actually demonstrates for us, for what it means to grow up. So we're going to have that conversation, as we're growing up as a church. Let's look at growing up as individuals too. Because those lists that we made at the beginning of this time, the things that our culture tells us about what adulting looks like, how we get there according to our culture, climb the ladder, work hard, right? Work harder, faster, more, climb the ladder, make smart financial decisions, get the newest thing, be fierce and relentless and good at all the things. And we can achieve a lot when we're in that zone. And we need to be, it's okay to access that and live in that place. We need that for the container building, for that sense of self. But Jesus points us in the opposite direction if we actually want to grow up. Jesus doesn't point up the ladder, he points down. The sign of Jonah. And also here in another text that I want us to hear. So in the final days before Jesus is arrested, put on trial, tortured, and executed, before all of that, he has a few just final revolutionary conversations with his closest friends. And in one of them, it's in John 12, verses 24 and 25. It's the Message version. This is what he says. Unless a grain of wheat is buried in the ground, dead to the world, it is never any more than a grain of wheat. But if it is buried, it sprouts and reproduces itself many times over. In the same way, anyone who holds on to life as it is destroys that life. But if you let go reckless in your love, you'll have it forever, real and eternal. Do you hear the movement over the threshold into the second half of life that Jesus is describing? Anyone who holds on to life just as it is destroys that life. But if we let go reckless in our love, that's the second half of life. And in other versions it says, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground. This is the image for us in the Jesus story, and the image for us that we're going to hold this Lent at Salt House, to be like seeds, these grains of wheat. Seeds that must fall to the ground in order to find the reproducing life that we're made for. The Jesus story invites us to see how the way forward and up and the way into growth and cultivating ourselves and achieving and becoming who we are is accomplished through not our hard work and sweat and study and success, but the crucial teacher, the catalyst of transformation that moves us upward actually begins in letting go, in falling to the ground, failing, being buried, dying. It all must fail us. That's how growth happens. The journey up actually begins by moving down. This is the only pattern that Jesus promises us for our lives, and we see this pattern mirrored in other traditions as well. Native religions speak of winter and summer. Mystical authors speak of darkness and light. Eastern religions speak of yin and yang, or the Tao. Christians call it the Paschal mystery. But we're all pointing at the same necessity of both descent and ascent, and usually in that order. Moving down in order to grow up. That's why we're calling our journey this Lent, Falling Upward, which is also the title of one of Richard Rohr's books, where he explores much of this thematic stuff more fully. I will likely keep pulling from content from him, because I do have such a theological crush on him that I like to go where he goes. But just some really great stuff that'll help us through some of this as well. And to be clear, on the other side of Lent, it's not like we'll all have moved to the second half of life, right? Like, okay, guys, let's do this journey, and then we'll all be there. That sound good? So first half of life. So I'm not promising us that. There's nothing anyone can say or teach or reveal to us this Lent that will move us over the threshold of the second half of life. Why? Because I can't send like a whale after you. I can't force you into a time of darkness, or that's not going to happen. You're welcome that I can't do that, but we can name and help normalize and understand the landscape that this is what our life actually can look like. This counterintuitive movement down in order to grow up and beyond. And we can form practices together this Lent, ways of ritualizing and naming what's happened in us, so looking back at our stories and maybe reframing what we've lived through, but also maybe just finding better peace and understanding for what's happening now too, or even then to be able to hold maybe just perspective for as we live through new things, we will have built some muscle memory around not running in the opposite direction like Jonah, but actually recognizing something when it's happening, even if it still means being in the darkness as we face suffering and failure, because we will. So how do we practice together then, being people who let go, who let ourselves fall? This is what we're going to explore together in Falling Upward. And it begins today with that paper that you've continued to make a list on, I hope. I do invite you to be sure to name like all the things you can, just capturing some of that first half of life stuff that you have been told matters. Hold that. And you may have already figured out that this weird paper that you're holding is actually, we weren't trying to make it even like more suffering in the writing process because it's just a little bit of weird paper. We want to make it as hard as possible so you feel like you can move. No. That paper is actually seed paper. So that means that there are seeds, petunia seeds, a bunch of different flowers are woven into the fabrics of this natural paper. And with this big container that we have up here is a planter and some more soil. So Jesus says, unless it is buried in the ground, dead to the world, it's never any more than a seed. But if it's buried, it sprouts and reproduces itself many times over. In the same way, anyone who holds onto life just as it is destroys that life. But if you let go, reckless in your love, you'll have it forever, real and eternal. So in a moment, you're invited to let those seeds fall, to practice letting go of life just as it is, to practice being reckless in our love by bringing your list, your seeds forward, and to be buried in the soil. And doing so, to embody this practice of letting things die that need to die. So you can come up, you can dig your fingers in there and stick it in there. There's a little shovel if you want to just put it in there and put more soil over. So however you want to do that is awesome, but just let it be in there. It doesn't have to be totally covered, so don't get too worried. I mean, just put it in. It's going to be okay. So just put that in there and let your seed fall. So here then we get to let our seeds, at least in practice, those seeds of the first half of life, begin to fall. So as we do this, we're going to sing also of the beautiful things that God makes out of dust, out of us, out of those impossibly hard moments in our lives. So feel free to come up during the song and do this, or to come up during Holy Communion, or to come up after worship, whatever works for you. But please do try to take time to let your seeds fall. So as we do this, let's take a moment to pray.